Hi everyone, welcome to Tech Booth. Today, an introduction to the exposure triangle and how to adjust the parameters on your Nikon D3500. I'm going to be using this camera to demonstrate the different adjustments simply because it has a nice graphical interface that shows you the three in action as we adjust them. Now, photography is about light, both quantity and quality of light. And as you progress within your photographic career, you will learn how to manipulate both the quantity and the quality of your light. The exposure triangle is a set of three parameters that you can adjust on your camera to regulate the amount of light that goes into your camera. Those three parameters are also used for other creative purposes, but for the purposes of this introductory tutorial, we're going to be looking at how you adjust those three parameters to regulate the amount of light that goes into your camera. The three parameters that we're going to be looking at that make up the exposure triangle are your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO sensitivity. When you adjust these parameters separately or individually, they determine how bright or how dark your image becomes. But they also work together to give you a certain look when you take a picture. The reason they are depicted in a triangle as the exposure triangle is because they all are linked and they affect each other. So when you adjust your shutter speed or you adjust your aperture, then the remaining two have to also be adjusted so that you get that perfect exposure. When you put your camera in full auto mode, the camera adjusts all three of those parameters to give you what it thinks is the perfect exposure. But as you make your journey into professional photography, you will want to adjust these parameters yourself to get that perfect look that you are looking for. Let us begin with the shutter speed. When you take a picture, so when you press and you take a picture, there is a curtain or a barrier that opens up to let light into your lens and then closes once that picture is taken. So from the time it opens to the time it closes is your shutter speed. And that shutter speed is measured in seconds. So you'll see figures like 1/200th of a second or 1/4000th of a second. That is your shutter speed. And so the longer that barrier is open, the more light will go into your camera, the brighter the image. The shorter that barrier is open, the less light goes into your camera, the darker the image. An image that is exposed for 1 second will be much brighter in the same conditions than one that is exposed at 1/4000th of a second. And there are reasons why you would use those different shutter speeds, but for now, for the purposes of this lesson, just know that the lower the number at the bottom, the longer the shutter is open, the more light goes in, the brighter the image. And the shorter or the bigger the number at the bottom, remember this is a fraction, so the bigger the number at the bottom, so if you have something like 500, that means the shutter is open for 1/500th of a second. That image will be darker than the one that is open for 1/20th of a second or any other figure like that. So shutter speed is the first one. The next item we want to talk about is your aperture. The aperture is like the iris of your eye. It closes up to reduce the amount of light going into the lens and opens up to allow more light, and that's self-explanatory. So the more open it is, the more light goes into the camera, the brighter your image. The more closed it is, the less light goes into the camera, the darker the image. The figures for aperture are also known as the f-stop or simply the f value. So you'll see values like f2.8, f5.6, and so on. F values can be a bit tricky and confusing because they're actually fractions. So without going into the math of how they are derived, just know that when you see a small figure like f2.8, that means your aperture is more open than a bigger number like say f5.6. 5.6 is a smaller opening, and f22 is an even smaller opening. When you go from f2.8, that's a bright image under the same conditions, to f22 is a darker image under the same conditions, because at f22 the aperture is very small compared to f2.8. Now the aperture is controlled at the lens end of your camera. That means the values or the apertures that your lens is capable of doing depends on the lens that you have. So remember, the smaller the number, f.28, the more the light, the brighter the image. The higher the number, f22, the smaller the iris, the darker the image. The third component of the exposure triangle is your ISO sensitivity. What this is a measure of how sensitive the sensor that receives the light on your camera is to light. So if you fix everything else, you have the same amount of light. When you move your ISO up from, let's say, 200 to 500, your sensor becomes more sensitive to the same amount of light, resulting in a brighter image. So you're not changing the amount of light that's going in per se, but you're changing the sensitivity of your camera to the light that's available. But one word of warning about ISO is that the higher your ISO, the more chances that you'll get a grainy picture, because this is like a digital enhancement of your image. And so the more digital enhancement is made to your image, the more it degrades and it reaches a point where your image is too grainy to be of much value. A good rule of thumb for most cameras, especially prosumer level cameras, is try and keep your ISO below 800 at all times. If you have to, you can push it up a bit, but 800 is a good maximum to deal with, and always use the minimum setting whenever you can. Controlling the amount of light that goes into your camera and the sensitivity of your camera to light is only one aspect of the exposure triangle, and that's the one that we're just dealing with today. The other aspects have to do with controlling the look of your image. For example, how much of your image is in focus and how much is out of focus, and also if you are shooting things like sports, how to freeze the action. That's where you choose which of those settings you need to adjust. So remember, when you're in full auto mode, your camera controls all three aspects to give you the right exposure. When you are in full manual mode, you control all three to get the exposure that you want. But there are also middle modes that I like to call semi-automatic modes, and these are modes where you fix one and then your camera adjusts the other two to get you the right exposure. So that's your brief introduction to the exposure triangle. Practice and learn how to adjust aperture, learn how to adjust your shutter speed, learn how to adjust your ISO, and see how that works on your camera, and then you can move on to start using those creatively in your photography. That's it for today for Tech Booth. See you next time. Make sure you subscribe. If you like the video, give us a like. If you have any comments, put them down below so we can improve the content that we bring to you on this channel.